First, a thank you to the London Policy and Strategy Network and the policy design community for the invitation to join you today. I have the honour of being on the delivery board for the policy design community, along with my colleague, Professor Liz Richardson from Manchester University, related to our AHRC Design and Policy Network. And being part of that has been an important forum to understand the growing and varied use of design approaches in local and central government and public services. And just a note on your network, I know how potential opportunities for learning and debate and dialogue are as part of professional work, and how much work is required to curate and organise them to deliver those opportunities. So I'm very happy to be part of this series. Brief introduction about myself. So I'm a design academic, Professor of Contemporary Design Practices at Central St Martin's, which is one of the constituent colleges at University of the Arts London, where I've been since 2015, following a year working in Policy Lab, then a tiny team in the Cabinet Office through an AHRC fellowship, and previously at the University of Brighton and Said Business School, University of Oxford. So that's my sort of academic background, but more than 25 years ago, I found myself designing websites and what we would now call digital user experiences, and making artworks with data. And it was through those efforts to develop design-based or creative-based capabilities in large organisations, often partial, unsuccessful, uncontested, that I ended up turning to academic research. In my research, I try to understand, describe, evaluate, and contextualise how and in what circumstances design, broadly conceived, can be built up to achieve organisational and social and public policy goals. So most of the people in this network would probably agree there's growing interest and investment in design in relation to government and public services and evidence of public outcomes. Design and designers are enabled and supported, but sometimes blocked from making contributions to shape the future worlds that citizens and members of the public live, care, study, work and die in. Much of the focus in that discussion on design in relation to government and public policy focuses on what design is. For example, producing lists of characteristics. And Katerina, maybe you could show my first slide, which is basically a list of distinctive characteristics of design. So this is my list, just to give you a sense. It might be different to your list, but it's just a sense. It's trying to, yes, you need to put it on. Thank you. So here's a list of characteristics associated with design, and there are many such lists, just to give you a sense of what I mean by design, which might be different to what you mean by design. But at least as relevant as what design is the question of what design does and how we can make sense of those outcomes. And what design does and doesn't do as a practice, as a body of knowledge, as a profession, is tied up with organisational contexts, infrastructures and wider narratives. So in the time I have available today, I'm going to focus on thinking about understanding design capabilities inside government using perspectives from academic research. And in particular, I'm going to use two concepts, dynamic capabilities and institutional logics. So let's start with capabilities. Now there's obviously lots of different ways of using this term, but the way I'm using capabilities comes from, could you not show that slide, Chet? Just not quite ready for that. So the term capabilities comes from a long-standing area of research which illuminates how organisations improve performance, typically through managerial action. And one of the established ideas from David Teese and colleagues is that organisations can be analysed in terms of dynamic capabilities, which is understood as stable patterns of organisational behaviour. And very briefly, that author Teese distinguishes between capabilities for sensing, seizing and transforming as organisations identify and respond to changes in the external environment. And very briefly, sensing capabilities are those which sense, filter, shape and calibrate changes or opportunities in the landscape. Seizing capabilities involve structures, procedures, designs, and incentives for responding to those opportunities, and then transforming capabilities are those about realigning what the organisation does and its resources. So that's a very brief and simplification of this body of research, of which, like with all research, there's different ways of thinking about those things. If we could move to the next slide, this is a grab, and just to indicate to you the way that that underlying thinking gets used. So I just described to you the sensing, seizing, and transforming. That's in the middle column there. And this comes from a study by Jean Liedker from 2020, which draws on over, I think, 70 case studies of design thinking specifically as implemented in business, social enterprise, and local government. And she found that practices associated with design thinking, so that's the list of characteristics down the left, which is rather similar to my list of what is design I showed you earlier, those aligned and enabled the dynamic capabilities from the management literature. So that basically she showed that how design thinking capabilities enabled overcoming social and psychological barriers to innovation. So again, across about 70 case studies. And the way she used this was to then position design in contrast to other forms of innovation. She called design a social technology, enabling organizations to build capabilities for adaptation. So the importance of this study is that it's quite large scale and it integrates studies of design and links it to studies of organization. And just as an example from that study, she argued that having a user-centered focus, something many of us involved in design would say is central to design, a user or human-centered focus, enabled the seizing opportunity because it allowed the organizations to immerse themselves in stakeholders' perspectives rather than their more parochial ones from each of their teams. And that shared focus on the user or the stakeholder or the citizen facilitated alignment across the teams and helped them prioritize. So that sounds quite simple and obvious, but what's useful about that research is based on a quite large scale integration of various studies. So the takeaway, could we have the next slide? The takeaway from this large scale study is that applying the distinctive capabilities of design, although that was specifically design thinking, can help organizations respond proactively and innovate to changes in the external environment. So I'm going to move on, staying with the concept of capabilities, to a different study, and this is in the next slide, associated with service design, and this is from a book with the title Service Design Capabilities by Nicola Morelli and colleagues. And they argued, if you look down the left-hand side of the table, there's 3 levels at which design can contribute to service development. So down the left, you've got 3 rows: services interaction, services infrastructure, and services systemic institution. And these authors in this study argued that capabilities associated with service design do different things at different levels. So the characteristic, for example, of design to visualize and materialize at the first level, service as interaction, might include doing some very detailed design work for a digital interface, or indeed a letter from DWP, for example, like I got the other day, that a member of the public will receive. So visualization is very specific at that level. But if you're using visualization capability at the middle level, it may be less important there, used in a different way, making tangible for participants involved in, for example, a cross-government program or service, how the elements come together. So the visualization capability is doing something different. And then visualization may be indeed less important at the systemic institution, the third level, and it might be really sort of embedded into vision building to explore futures through embodied creative practices. So visualization, that thing that we say is a core, often say is a core practice of design, actually might be doing different things at different levels. And if we could move to the next slide, the takeaway from this research is that the application of design achieves different outcomes at different levels. and they provide a framework for that. A brief bit of recognition that the term capabilities is often linked to another term, competences, often associated with an individual characteristic, such as somebody's knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviours, tied to achieving organisational performance. But as I understand it, the term competence is more at the individual level, and the term capabilities focuses on the organisation, although clearly there are relationships and interdependencies between the two. But if we now have a brief look at the competence, studies of design competence, there's growing interest in this to understand in particular what competences students that we teach in universities, what they need to develop as part of degrees. And if you go to the next slide, one example is by some colleagues, including one of my colleagues, and then also working in colleagues with Canada. So they developed this design competence framework to enable discussion and assessment specifically in higher education. So this has been developed for use in teaching of design in higher education. And as you can see here, it's got 16 blobs, so that's 16 categories at 4 levels, which includes what they call core skills, the top row, and then things focused on, say, images and media, and then the bottom level is more sort of what they call thought, is more sort of cognitive processes required by designer. So they developed this and tested it with quite a number of students, and have actually developed some sort of digital framework version. And if you move to the next slide, there's another example of something like this, developed by some researchers and educators in Canada, also focusing on how to assess design competence in higher education. I have now, there we go, let me just, so both of these things are doing a very particular job, and that job is to do with assessment and developing of courses in higher education, so not immediately portable to other contexts. And there's obviously more work to be done to link these individual level competences to organisational capabilities. But what's striking in both these studies is the emphasis they put on co-creating these frameworks with their stakeholders, and how they developed visualizations of these frameworks as reflective tools to open up conversations in participants. So if we move to the next slide, the takeaway from these two studies is that design competences can be rendered as something to discuss and participate in assessing, rather than being a top-down evaluation. So moving on, not yet to the next slide, having briefly discussed capabilities and competences, I'm going to turn to another strand of research in studies of organisations, which is known as institutional logics. And institutional logics is a way of examining the practices, the beliefs, the rules that are built into how organisations make collective sense of things and which shape action. Basically, a simple way of putting it is that institutional logics explain the way things are done around here, which are taken for granted by members of that institution or community. And there are some elements of the research in this. They identify top level categories like the market, the state, the corporation, the profession, the religion, the community, the family, and so on. So those are examples of very high level institutions. But not all researchers use those. But the people working in this area do agree that there is a general area of study that's worth of merit, which is to understand how things are done around here. The standard operating practice that relies on very deep, formal and informal, written and tacit, acknowledged and implied understandings and routines that are accepted as just what happens here, which make things work, but they're also part of the reason why practices are so hard to shift. So that's a very brief summary of a very large, complex area of work. By the way, and I'm not expert in any of these things, I'm trying to make sense of them for design, but institutional logics is a substantive subfield in studies of organisations, and it covers things like, how do these logics operate? How do they change over time? How do some logics become dominant? and how do practitioners in organisations negotiate competing logics. And this is actually becomes useful to understand what happens when design practices or teams are introduced or established in organisations. And of course, it's not the only way of understanding that. There's others. But so, for example, if we can move, oh no, I don't have a slide for this. I'm going to just briefly summarise a study by Sedali Kurtmulayev, which focused on a very large telecoms firm, which over several years built up a capability in service design. And basically, they started by organising some training in service design for lots of managers, and staff rapidly absorbed the language that you'd expect, such as customer journey and empathy and so on. But while they adopted the terms, they were slower to actually adopt the practices, let alone routinely integrate them into the way things were done in the organisation. However, there were some teams that much more rigorously implemented a service design approach and had some impressive results. So the researchers concluded that service designing did have the potential to transform the organisation, not just offer some tools or be a phase, but it depended on this underlying institutional logic in the firm. And they used that lens to try and analyse what was going on, the sort of way things are done around here, logic in that firm. And what they found was a market logic alongside a corporation logic. And what the design introduction helped with was disclosing some of the inherent contradictions between those two logics, as well as advancing towards change in those logics. Again, this is quite a large-scale study, although in one case. So the takeaway here from this study, next slide. Okay, forget it. Anyway, I've moved on to the next. So there's a different takeaway. I put it on a different slide, don't worry. Right, so staying with that institutional logics lens, and also service design, this is an image comes from some research in a different sector, healthcare, by Daniela Sangiorgi and colleagues. So they use this institutional logics to try and understand how design approaches, service design, might be useful in healthcare. And they noted up that healthcare is made up of many different types of organisational actor. So obviously clinicians, frontline administrative staff and back office staff, businesses, as well as government bodies, and each of which is caught up in narratives and infrastructure and different types of expertise and different ways of how things are done around here. So as a result, they and other researchers argue that there's several institutional logics competing at once in healthcare. For example, as this visualization showed, they identified specifically state, market, community and professional. So that's what you can see in the left-hand circles. There's 4 different types of logic operating. And what you see in this this visualization from this study by Sangiorgi and colleagues, which includes some work in the NHS. In fact, this is from specifically from a UK-based project, I think, is that they use that framing to say, okay, if we're introducing something called service design into an organisation in healthcare, let's see what happens, what's it like at the beginning, what are the institutional logics in play, and at the end. So the top line is the beginning of the design project, where you can see the state is darker green, right? So that's the logic that's really dominant. But there's also the yellow on the right-hand side is quite strong as well. Whereas towards the end of the design project, the sort of state logic is actually weaker, and they've also got some levels going on that I haven't got time to discuss. But you can see that the professional logic is stronger at the end of the project. And the right-hand box basically shows that there's moderate conflict at the beginning of the project, and there's this strong emphasis of the state logic in the project. But at the end of the project, the different types of logic, state, market, profession, and community are actually reasonably aligned, although the rest of the paper shows things that it doesn't always end up like that. So the takeaway from this project, and we could go to the next slide, this is from both of those two things. The first one is that introducing tools and processes may not necessarily result in significant positive benefits because there are dominant logics that hold things together. So that was the first study I mentioned. And then if you click, the second takeaway from this healthcare one is through the application of design, perceptions about institutional logics can be revealed. So that tool itself helped members of those teams have a conversation about what was going on and these hidden, invisible, taken for granted ways of doing things. And sometimes those logics can be changed through the application of design. So let's move, not yet, move on. So what I've done, thank you, what I've done is to basically take two concepts from which are well established in studies of organizations, dynamic capabilities and institutional logics, and I've shared some recent research specifically about design, the first being design thinking and the second service design. And I hope you can begin to see the relevance of these findings to building up capabilities and design in central local government and policy. So I now basically want to just pull this together and close by saying, just summarising what needs to be considered when building design capabilities inside of government. And so this is really aimed at managers, leaders involved in making the case for building, leading or evaluating design capabilities. So if we go to the next slide. Thank you. And the first point, thank you. The first requirement is really to clarify which competences at an individual level associated with different specialisms, UX, service design, etc., are required in government. And there's bundles of skills, knowledge, attitudes and behaviours associated with them. They're not all the same. Some of which might be shared across design tasks and the job family, as you have in the DDAT current capability framework, but some of which are likely to be specific to particular roles and tasks. And not just tasks, as the research has shown, it might actually be levels of work inside organisations. So these capabilities and these competencies do different things at different levels in the work of government. So that's really a requirement to be more specific and more nuanced about the capabilities associated with design in the work of government. The second consideration, thank you, is how competing institutional logics, remember how things are done around here, taken for granted and so on, how those can enable or hinder building up design capabilities. And it's probably relatively clear that in local or central government, there are probably multiple logics coexisting and competing. And if we did use the terminology from Thornton and colleagues, you might expect to see the logic of government and bureaucracy, the logic of professional expertise, the logic of managerialism, the logic of the market, the logic of community. Those all might coexist in different bits of government. And the result of these pre-existing, deeply embedded ways of doing things around here can be that a department that's introducing design methods or tools or building a team may not be able to leverage the beneficial outcomes of applying design because existing logics might get in the way of getting value from those investments. But there is potential, as that healthcare example showed, to surface those competing logics and potential that introducing to designers may introduce new logics into the or lead to realignments of the different logics. And then a third consideration is to recognise the potential for the people doing or engaging with design as co-creators and defining these assessments and assessing these capabilities and competences, as the two examples showed, which are currently being used or developed in the context of higher education, not immediately portable, but the principle of involving people in that. So to summarise, and I'm going to stop here, what I've tried to offer is some concepts to illuminate the challenges and potential of building up design capabilities inside government, and I've used some well-established analytical lenses and research that's looked at this quite seriously, and hopefully these begin to offer a language to talk with more precision about design capabilities in government. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to stop sharing there, and let's open up the floor for questions. Either if you want to raise your hand using the raise your hand function in Teams, or write a question in the chat, and our colleague Priya will keep an eye on the chat as well. I know there are some comments and questions in there already. So Kate is wondering, HOW reinvent the sometimes stereotype of design people with stickers on laptops drinking elaborate coffees. Let's see what's the question. Kate, do you want to unmute yourself and perhaps, or did you have a question? If not, then we have a hand up. Jan, do you want to unmute yourself and...
Hi, how are you doing? Thanks for the presentation, Lucy. Well, my name is Jan. I've got different hats here, but basically I've been working on innovation capabilities for quite a long time. I just co-wrote a chapter for a book soon to be released that is sort of Daniela also put us all together, and about something that I wanted to ask you about. It's mainly something that maybe is not really, or your thoughts about the facilitation capabilities of designers in government. Understanding facilitations as the art of making things easier for a group of people, for a social system that not necessarily always trying to embed. For instance, when you are running a service design sort of training program for civil servants. So what are your thoughts about that specific capabilities, and what are the things that you think might be needed for designers to be more involved in government, especially in hierarchical and complex organizations?
Thank you. Great question and quite enormous. It's making me think of a conversation I had the other day with somebody working, a senior leader of a team doing these kinds of things inside a local government, who was basically their view was that economics is the sort of dominant expertise recognised as they saw it. So introducing an expertise that is focused on learning, iteration, not having the right answer in advance, but co-designing and developing and exploring and prototyping or to get different answers and different solutions along the way, that doesn't have Nobel Prizes associated. There's no Nobel Prize for design, right? So again, this is where if the institutional logics are associated with an expertise of economics, it's then hard to see how capabilities around facilitation play into that, because they have to work within a competing logic that doesn't necessarily welcome uncertainty. So this is why I think the combination of those two things is helpful, the institutional logics to understand what is it like at the moment, and what are the deeply held sort of assumptions and beliefs and values embedded in the organisation, even if you introduce new facilitation. So I think there's been, a lot of the work I've done over many years, and I'm sure many of you in this meeting, on this call, are doing facilitation work, and sometimes it looks like nothing, right? The actual deep skill of doing it, of understanding what's going in a room and sort of punctuating the sort of equilibrium and facilitating that learning, and having permission, and as well as the skills, the individual skills and competences to do it, is a phenomenal skill. And quite often design people have that and end up holding that space because organisations are not themselves oriented to this learning because of institutional logics that recognise certainty and other forms of expertise. So I think there's huge potential. It's untapped potential. I'd love to read the thing you wrote.
Thank you so much. Should we go to Sabina? Sorry, I can't see the full name. I think Sabina. Sabina,
Hi,
sorry.
Lucy. Great
Hi,
seeing
Sabina.
you. Thanks for the talk. I was super curious and I'm super delighted. It's been a while since I've been able to join into something like that. I'm absolutely with you on all of what you're saying. Obviously, that is also very much connected with how I would see things emerging. I also come back from or have a background in this organizational setting. I was wondering though, for one point, because you talk about institutional logics, and I have started to talk about design legacies. So what you would describe as institutional logics is coming out of the frame of organizational studies and kind of like the external world, so to speak. And I'm wondering, because I've looked at it as design legacies, meaning that if you go into an organization as a designer, it's maybe more meaningful and helpful if you go and look for design that's already there, which are basically design legacies from these logics that you would describe as logics, so that you can understand them in terms of design and then also connect to them as a designer, first of all, from your own practice and your own training, but also because it helps you, you mentioned it yourself, to start conversations with others who are not so well versed in the design language, but then they can see, people in the organization can then see why you would speak to design, because there's a design practice, there's a design principle, there's a design method, there's a design process. You can actually pinpoint to that. So I just wonder from your own, and give me your personal opinion or whatever, because is it worth pursuing something like design legacies and making that part of a vocabulary for us? Or is it, in your mind, better to pursue the terms of the other disciplines, so to speak? So that I would be really interested in that. Thanks. And thanks for the talk, was awesome already.
Thank you, Sabina. So I think you're right that there are traces or legacies of previous activity in organizations, and organizations that's trying to understand its own, let's call it, assets and resources and its own logic will hopefully be attentive to previous histories, and they can be important. As you know, I taught well, maybe you don't know all that detail, but I've taught a design thinking, or a version of it, a sort of mashup of design thinking and service design on the MBA for 15 years at Said Business School, 2 MBAs, and then on the MBA we have here at Central St Martin's. And I used to say to these managers, like, I don't care if you use the word design, that the design word doesn't matter, right? What matters is these capabilities, these practices. And obviously there's a lot of relationship between agile work practices and indeed co-production practices, more from political science and governance and policy. And in the dialogues I have at the moment with Liz Richardson from Manchester and Catherine Giroux, and we're just writing something on this, they're experts in co-production and design. They've been thinking about these things and doing it for years. So they're really interested in what's this. We already do those things, right? So what's design?
Exactly.
What's that design thing? So I'm never so fussed about the word design, because I'm much more interested in the practices, the capabilities, and the thing that we call design is only those practices. It's really tied to modernity, late 20th century, early 21st century, digitalization, customerization, customer focus, and so on. And so it's already contingent. So I personally don't care if the word design is important or not. I do agree that the legacies and sort of understanding what is there in the organization and then being able to connect with that, if that's useful, makes sense. That would be.
Thank you. I mean, like, of course, for me, agile is a design legacy if it exists in an organization. Process-driven design or the design principles, that these are design legacies. So that's still under that realm. I'm under that. It's just like a matter of exactly encapsulating that and understanding that they're already doing it. And not that you come in as designer and you do something new. So from it's just in my experience it's an interesting way to connect with the organizational system and its elements. But thanks.
Thank you, Sabine.
Yes, we have Diane has a hand up as well. Diane, do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead? And you are unmuted, so we should be able to hear you. You're unmuted again.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now
Oh,
we can hear you. Amazing.
Great. All right. Sorry about that.
No worries.
I think my camera is not working now. But thank you so much for such an insightful and really good talk. I worked at NHSX actually in the early days when it was set up and in capability building, and the way how we're approaching it was to really being embedded into policy teams, actually to work with them and embed these design practices. And I wonder, I noticed that we developed a few different evaluation models to really understand our impact and understand to what point we were making a difference in the way how policies were developed, designed, implemented. And one of the difficulties actually we faced was actually most of it, very often, whenever we were embedded into policy teams, we would work with them to design and launch something. And towards the end, so probably 6-9 months, sometimes a bit more, it was there was so many people actually who had left the team. And probably sometimes these people would have gone to a digital team. So actually, that's in itself a good success, because obviously you've built a capability that built that enthusiasm towards design and digital that has even changed their career orientations. That's really good. Particularly, is that how do you measure that? You know, if you've got this constant move and one in healthcare and in particular in government, people don't stay anyway in jobs very often. I mean, very long, because of the way how pay rewards and the system is designed from an HR point of view. So yeah, do you have any thoughts, any insights, or awareness of any research on evaluation of capability building models in government?
Thanks very much. Very useful to hear that example. So I also should emphasize, I think I said I'm a design researcher, so I'm not an organization studies researcher, although I find useful some of that work in that field. What I would say that when I'm trying to understand the healthcare system, which is obviously massive, I turn to the work by Glenn Robert and colleagues at King's College London, who now for well over more than a decade, it's more like 15 years, before NHSX, but they did some various studies of the introduction of design-like things, design-like activities, processes, methods into healthcare improvement, and found are doing a kind of evaluation. And they even in one study did a randomized controlled trial, or some other colleagues did, comparing the use of design, what they call experience-based co-design, into healthcare innovation and assessing the changes it made. So there are pockets of studies, basically, of what happens when this thing called design is introduced. And so I'm just giving an example of over there in healthcare innovation studies, there's quite deep and systematic study of this. I think in the public sector, government and let alone public policy making, these are at a different stage of maturity in terms of the research and evaluation. So I think there's a lot we can learn from other fields that have been studying these developments for longer.
Thanks. That's really helpful. Thank you.
I'll put his name in the chat.
I was going to ask, yeah. Thanks.
Yes, it's not King's, he's at King's College. Sorry, I wrote that back. Glenn Robert at King's College, London.
That's really useful. Thank you. Any more questions? The floor is open. So any more questions, either if you want to raise your hand or just share any thoughts that you have.
There are certain things in the chat that we can probably take. Christine mentions that I joined a bit late, so apologies. But in two parts, I'm struggling to think of a concrete example of the logics mentioned. What I can think of are elements that are so ingrained that people don't perceive them anymore, making them hard to identify. So I'm wondering what skills and tools would help with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Right. So this is the, again, I'm not an expert in studying institutional logics. There's a whole load of people who study it, often obviously in business and sometimes in public sector and government. And what I've shared with you today is people who are using it to study the introduction of design specifically. But that example I showed you actually was a screen grab from some tools that were developed to help the participants in the projects reveal to themselves what logics were at play. So if you read that paper, and I think it's open access, I will share afterwards the references, but some of these are open access and some of these unfortunately not. They're behind academic research paywalls. But that one I think is open access. So that means you can actually look at how they developed that framework and how they used it in healthcare projects to do that before and after analysis. So that's an example of a way to reveal what people perceive as being the logics that are operating in their project. So that is a specific example.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful. Any more questions, thoughts, ideas that you would like to share? I know some people have asked as well in the chat if if the recording will be shared. It will be shared. We can make sure to send it out to those of you who had to leave and those of you attending today. It will be shared on the London Policy and Strategy Network YouTube channel, where you can also find lots of other events. Priya, have you spotted any more thoughts and ideas or questions in the chat?
There's one more very interesting thing that Chloe Tyler has mentioned, not necessarily a question probably, but it's more of her thoughts. She says, interestingly, how certainty and economics versus co-creation and uncertainty feels to be gendered somehow. And I wonder how these gendered associations impact how they are received by organizations.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Again, I would defer to, I was in a business school for 5 years as a member of staff. I am hugely aware how enormous the fields of organisation and management studies are, covering everything from strategy to operations management to digital to marketing, human resource, all the elements of what organisations do. But there is a core interest in what are organizations, what do they do, how do they change, and then also what is the role of the manager or different functions and how do they intersect, and so within that, in particular, critical management studies, which then problematizes some of those things. There probably is lots of work on that question. I would go there to look for it, and then you've got the problem of closed journals you can't access. But I think there is a broader problem. I think it's also not just gendered. It's also there's probably an approach to understanding who gets to voice doubts, the power dynamics, who gets to voice doubts, hesitance, uncertainties, and who doesn't, or challenges to authority and so on. So I think power is implicit in all the things we've been talking today, and in my field, design, there's growing attention to plurality, not just talking about human-centered design in a relatively consumery, simplistic way, but recognizing plural perspectives, which are not just divergent, but contestation, as people have different situated positions and ways of different power relations in relation to not just the service or the change or the impacts on them. So I agree, gender and other sorts of inequality that are structured in what gets taken seriously and advanced more broadly.
Thank you. That was really interesting. Just spotted a long comment there. Correct me if I have misunderstood, and apologies, as I am in a noisy space and not able to come off mute. That's okay. But by institutional logics is the proposal to replace existing logics with new logics. And as a tangential question, one of the beauties of design is the opening up of new possibilities and ideas, but these are often then informed on by institutional requirements as to which ideas to take forward into policy, services, products. I wonder what your take on that is, or whether I have missed the point.
Yeah. Thank you. So just to clarify, again, this is my understanding as a design scholar trying to use some of this thinking in organisation studies. Institutional logics is a way of being attentive to the things that are taken for granted in organisations. So it's not necessarily to change them, it's just to recognise those things, those logics, those practices, assumptions, values, beliefs, and people's alignment with those, and which then can constrain that mean that this is how we do stuff here, this is how we do it, and we don't do that thing because we don't do that here, right? So that's the institutional logics lens. But researchers in that field have recognised that there's often coexisting logics in an organisation, particularly large organisations which have different things going on and have been interventions that try and change them. So there are sometimes then competing logics in play in organisations. So that's just me explaining what I understand by institutional logics. And the two examples I gave from research by Kurt Molayev and then by Dan Sangiorgi and their colleagues. The first one really looked at deeply a case of a large telecoms company, and its change over time as service design was introduced. So there they found there was potential to reveal the challenges between the existing logics and to potentially introduce new ones. And then the healthcare example, again, they developed some very specific tools to help the participants in a project reveal the competing logics and then to observe any shifts over time. So the suggestion is that introducing design, which of course is this quite amorphous thing with various definitions and different ways of doing it, can potentially lead to changes in logics. So the answer is potentially, right? And this is the academic answer, potentially, and more studies are required. But I completely agree with your point that design these capabilities is opening up new possibilities and ideas, but they are in dialogue with how the organisation, how we do things around here. So sometimes, and I'm sure you've been in situations where people come up with incredible ideas in a sub-project or even in a workshop, and then they get closed down because, well, we can't do that, right? So at different levels and scales, at different moments, those new possibilities and ideas can be surfaced, can be explored, depending on, in a sense, what the institutional logic is, whether they're open to those things. And that's where the Jean Liedtke paper that I mentioned at the beginning was useful, because she was, over this quite large set of case studies, looking at the specific practices associated with design thinking, and where they enables steps towards innovation. And so that one isn't open access, that paper, but you might be able to find an unofficial version of it. And this is one of the problems with academic dialogue, right? That stuff is over there and stuff that you don't have access to. In a sense, we need to have more of these kind of fora to share some of this research to broaden it. So thank you for that question. I hope that has been useful.
There's a quite short question, but is institutional logics the same as or similar to kind of social norms of organizations?
Yeah. So I think the logic word, as I understand it, is also got on the symbolic level, right? These are to do with symbols, right? Which then mean that those are the norms. This is how we do things. Or culture is another slightly different way of looking at the same thing.
Great. Yeah, Sarah Kavik Jin says that. Thank you for a great talk. My PhD on reflexive practice, including specifically in design, has some interesting in crossovers in relation to what you have discussed. The focus was on designers and new methods in this area, but could potentially have links to organizations more broadly. Would be you're very welcome to present on your on your research at some point as well, Sarah, at the London Policy and Strategy Network. Would be great to hear. We are sort of closing, getting closer to 1 p.m. Any last questions or any kind of closing remarks from either the audience or you, Lucy?
No, just it's really a great idea that you run this network that's got different kinds of speakers sharing different, inside and outside government, including academics sharing different kinds of knowledge. And I've just shared 2 particular concepts which are wrapped up in loads of other stuff, and they're not right. They're not right. They're just some concepts which have been used in particular ways. And I think the knowledge that people who are leading design teams in organizations is important to surface, and so fora like this to bring these together are really valuable to have these discussions. So thank you for organizing.
No, thank you so much for attending today. And yeah, as I mentioned previously, the recordings will be shared on our YouTube channel. I'm going to also post a link to our upcoming events. In a month's time, we have Dan Hill coming to present on his work, which will be really exciting as well. Lucy, in case people have questions after the session, is there a way to get in touch with you?
I'll put my email in the chat. Whoops. It's gone capitals. There we are. Happy to have a conversation. Yep.
Amazing. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can contact me as well, or have any ideas for future events, either that someone that you know of that would like to present, or if you would like to present yourself, please just get in touch with me as well. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you, Lucy. Big applause for
thank you.
And yeah, I hope that everyone will have a wonderful Thursday afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.